Imperial Avenue, Cleveland, Ohio, summer 2008. A woman opens her kitchen window in the morning because it's warm and she wants the air in, and then almost immediately she closes it again, not because she decided to, because her body decided for her. That reflexive recoil that happens before your brain has time to explain what it's reacting to. The smell is back. It's been back for weeks now, maybe longer, that thick, sweet, heavy thing that sits over this part of Imperial Avenue like weather, that gets into your clothes and your curtains, and that you find yourself tasting hours later when you're nowhere near it. Her neighbor 2 doors down described it once as meat left in the sun too long. That's the closest anyone's come to getting it right. She's complained. Most people on this block have complained at some point, to the health department, to the city, to whoever would pick up the phone. And someone did come out, maybe a city inspector, probably just doing a walkthrough, and he looked at Ray's sausage shop on the corner and said, well, there it is. Meat processing, that's your smell. Filed his report and left. Anthony Sawwell, who lives in the white 3-story house at 11,205 Imperial, stops sometimes to chat with people on the block. Friendly enough, quiet. When the smell comes up, and it comes up, he shakes his head and says, yeah, Ray's, I've been meaning to say something myself. And people believe him. Why wouldn't they? He goes back inside. The windows on the 3rd floor are open, have been open all summer, even on the cooler days, even when it rains. The neighbors have noticed that, too, probably, and the way you notice things without quite deciding to. Nobody asks why, and the smell stays. This is the story of a monster the system had in its hands and let go. Before we begin, you up. Good. Forget the noise outside for a second. Leave the cars, the sirens, and the stress at the door. Tonight, these stories will unfold slowly and respectfully, accompanied by gentle rain and subtle, atmospheric visuals to create a calm space. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city you're in and what time it is there. And hit subscribe so we can stick together in the dark. We tell these dark stories not for entertainment or spectacle, and without any dramatization. We share them as a poignant reminder of the real people and real lives that were lost, and perhaps to help us recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, lower your volume just a bit, enough to let the rain gently carry you off to sleep. Lights off? Okay, good. Take a breath, a real one. Let's go back, way back. Anthony Edward Sawwell was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio, one of 7 children born to a woman named Claudia Garrison, who went by Gertrude, a single mother in a household that was, by the accounts of people who lived there, chaotic and violent from the beginning. Sawwell's niece Leona Davis talked about it later, talked about how Garrison subjected the children to physical abuse, how she would strip Davis naked in front of the other children and whip her with electrical cords until she bled, how the cruelty was routine and the adults responsible for these children were nowhere adequate to the task. And somewhere in that household, in those early years, something else was happening. Sawwell was 11 years old when he began sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl who also lived in the home, his own niece, another child in the same chaotic house. 11 years old. I don't know how long it went on. I don't know the full extent of what happened. And I'm aware that what was done to him and what he was doing to her were both happening at the same time in the same space, and that the adults around all of these children were failing every single one of them. That's true. And it's also true that a pattern was already forming in Anthony Sawell that would define the rest of his life. He grew up, joined the Marines, which is maybe surprising given everything, or maybe not surprising at all. The military as a structure for someone who grew up without any. He served for about a decade, I think, did 2 tours, was honorably discharged in 1985. People who knew him in the Marines described him as a decent soldier. Kept to himself, didn't cause problems. There's a version of Anthony Sawell's life where the military gives him enough structure to hold things together, and maybe for a while it did. But in 1989, he's 30 years old, back in Cleveland, back in the neighborhood. He attacks a woman, grabs her, chokes her, tells her he's going to kill her. She manages to get away. He's arrested, charged with attempted rape, pleads guilty in 1990, and gets 15 years. 15 years. He goes in, and here's the detail that comes up in everything written about this case. He was a model inmate, participated in programs, stayed out of trouble, did everything the system asks you to do when it's deciding whether you're safe to release. And in June 2005, after serving 15 years, Anthony Sawell walked out of prison. He was classified as a Tier 3 sex offender, the highest risk category, required to register, required to check in regularly. The system had looked at him and said, "This man is dangerous. Here is the category we put dangerous men in. Here are the reporting requirements." And then he went back to Imperial Avenue. The house at 11,205 Imperial Avenue is a 3-story place with white siding, the kind of older Cleveland housing stock that was probably nice once, probably housed working families for decades, that by 2005 was sitting on a block that had seen better years. Anthony Sawell moved in, got a job at a factory for a while, then lost it in 2007 and started collecting unemployment, selling scrap metal, getting by the way people get by when the formal economy has stopped having a place for them. He was on the sex offender registry. Probation officers checked in, made home visits the way they're supposed to. But here's the thing about those visits. Because Sawell wasn't on parole or probation for a current offense, just registered as a sex offender, the officers doing the checks didn't have the right to search the property without a warrant. They could knock on the door, confirm he was living there, check the boxes. That was the extent of it. So they knocked, he answered. They checked the boxes. And upstairs and in the basement, and in the backyard, things were accumulating that nobody was looking for. He was on a dating website. His profile said he was a master looking for a submissive person to train, which, I don't know, you could read as a red flag in retrospect, but a lot of people put strange things on dating profiles, and most of them aren't serial killers. Lori Frazier, a woman who happened to be the niece of Cleveland's mayor, started a relationship with him around 2007, moved in with him for a while. She would say later that she smelled something in the house, and that Sawell told her it was coming from his stepmother, who lived downstairs, or from Ray's sausage shop next door. She believed him. She stopped spending time at the house in 2008, for reasons she didn't fully explain publicly, maybe because something felt wrong, even if she couldn't name what it was. I don't know what she knew or suspected. I don't know what it's like to be inside that relationship, in that house, with that smell, and make sense of it with the information you have. What I do know is that by 2007, women were starting to disappear from the neighborhoods around Imperial Avenue. Crystal Dozier was 38 years old, a mother of 7, struggling with a crack cocaine addiction that had taken over her life the way addiction does, completely, reordering everything around it. She went missing in May 2007. Her family noticed. Her family reported it. And the police, according to accounts from the family and from reporters who covered this case, basically didn't follow up. Told them she'd probably come back when she was ready. Suggested that women who use drugs tend to drift in and out. Every single one of these women was black. Every single one struggled with addiction or mental health issues, or both. Every single one was the kind of person that the system, the police, the social services, the infrastructure that's supposed to notice when people go missing, had already learned to treat as low priority. And Anthony Sowell knew this. Maybe not in any calculated, conscious way. Maybe he didn't sit down and think through the demographics of who was likely to be searched for and who wasn't. But the pattern of who he chose tells you something about what he understood on some level, about whose absence would raise alarms and whose wouldn't. He was right for 2 years. The smell on Imperial Avenue got worse in 2008 and into 2009. More complaints to the health department. Another visit, another inspection, another reference to Ray's sausage shop. The sausage company, for its part, hired an environmental consultant to prove the smell wasn't coming from them. The consultant found nothing. The smell stayed. And Sowell, when it came up, just shook his head. Yeah, Ray's. Terrible, isn't it? He was still checking in with his sex offender registration requirements, still answering the door when the probation officers came, still living his life on Imperial Avenue, selling scrap metal, going online, inviting women back to the house. Tonya Carmichael was 53 years old. She'd worked as a medical secretary and a bartender, had earned her barber license and her real estate license, had 3 children. She'd been struggling with addiction for years, the kind of long, slow struggle that consumes everything eventually. Her mother reported her missing in December 2008. The police took the report, and then, as far as Tonya Carmichael's family could tell, nothing happened. September 2008. A woman named Gladys Wade knocks on a door on Imperial Avenue, bloodied and barely dressed, and tells the police that Anthony Sowell attacked her. She's taken to the hospital. A detective is assigned to the case. The detective tries to reach Sowell for weeks. Calls his phone, leaves messages, maybe stops by the house. Sowell doesn't respond, doesn't return the calls, and after enough time passes without contact, the case gets marked as unresolved and moved to the back of the queue. I want to be precise about what happened here because it matters. A woman came forward. She had injuries. She gave a name and an address, and the follow-up was insufficient. Not because the detective was necessarily a bad person, not because the system was designed to fail Gladys Wade specifically, but because the system was designed in a way that allowed cases involving women like her to fall through without anyone being required to catch them. She was a black woman with a history of drug use reporting an assault in a neighborhood that the city had long since stopped treating as a priority. Those factors compounded each other, and the result was that Anthony Sawwell went back to his house, and nothing changed. He had at least a year left, and on Imperial Avenue, the windows on the third floor stayed open. The smell stayed too, and the neighbors, if you asked them later, after everything came out, after the cameras arrived and the excavators showed up, and the whole block became a crime scene, most of them would say they knew something was wrong, that they'd always known something was wrong. They just couldn't get anyone to take it seriously. That's the thing that runs through this entire story, the thread that connects every part of it. Not one failure, not one bad decision, but a system that had been taught over years and decades to look away from certain streets and certain women and certain kinds of trouble. Anthony Sawwell didn't create that system. He just understood it well enough to live inside it for 2 years without anyone stopping him. Let me tell you about Crystal Dozier first, because she's where this starts, or where it starts as far as anyone can prove. Crystal was 38 years old in 2007. She had 7 children. 7. And she was in the middle of a crack cocaine addiction that had, by that point, reorganized her life completely, the way serious addiction does, where it becomes the center of gravity that everything else orbits around. Her family knew she was struggling. They were watching her struggle the way families watch, which is from close up and completely helpless, trying to stay connected while also understanding that they can't pull someone out of something that has its hooks that deep. She went missing in May 2007. Her family reported it, filed the paperwork, gave the police everything they had, waited for someone to come back with information, or at least questions. What they got instead was more or less nothing. The same response that other families in this neighborhood had been getting for years when they reported black women with addiction issues as missing. Not malicious, maybe, not a deliberate decision to ignore Crystal Dozier specifically, just a system that had, through years of practice, learned to treat certain kinds of missing persons reports as low priority. Women who use drugs come back when they're ready. That's what people were told. That's the explanation that got handed out like it was policy, because essentially it was. Crystal Dozier's body was eventually found in Anthony Sawwell's house. She'd been there in various states of decomposition for over 2 years before anyone came looking. Tashana Culver, Kim Smith, Imelda hunter. Imelda was 47 years old, and her sister called her a fighter, said she was an avid reader, loved the classics, the kind of person who could hold a real conversation about books and ideas, even when her life was falling apart around her. She worked as a beautician. She was a mother of 3. She struggled with addiction, the same struggle that made her invisible to the systems that should have noticed when she disappeared. Her family didn't even know to report her missing until the news broke in October 2009, and they started putting pieces together. She hadn't been reported because her family had lost track of where she was, the way you lose track of someone when addiction has been pulling them in and out of your life for years, and you've stopped being able to tell the difference between a disappearance and just another period of distance. Janice Webb, her neighbor Ida Garrett, 72 years old, told reporters afterward that she'd been worried about Janice since April 2009, when she stopped seeing her around. Had a bad feeling. Couldn't say why exactly, just that Janice was gone, and the absence felt different from the kind of absence that happens when someone's just moved on or gotten busy. Ida Garrett's bad feeling was right. Michelle Mason had grown up in Cleveland, left for a while, lived in New York and New Jersey, came back. Her family had filed a missing persons report when she stopped checking in. Grew frustrated with the lack of response. Grew frustrated with the lack of media coverage, too, because there wasn't any, not for Michelle Mason, not for any of these women, not for the disappearances that were accumulating in this part of Cleveland across 2007 and 2008 and into 2009. I keep thinking about what it must have been like to be those families during that period. To know something was wrong. To go to the police and be told essentially that your loved one had probably just wandered off. To watch the months pass with no information, no investigation, nothing visible being done, and to have no way to make anyone listen. In September 2009, a woman named Latunda Billups accepted an invitation from Anthony Sawell to come to his house and smoke crack. She went, and at some point during that visit, after some drinks, Sawell turned on her, became angry, hit her, choked her, raped her while she was drifting in and out of consciousness. He choked me real hard, she told police afterward, because my body started tingling. I thought I was going to die. She survived. She got out of that house and she went to the police and she told them what happened, gave them the address, gave them the name. Anthony Sawell, 11,205 Imperial Avenue. This was the third time, at minimum, that a woman had gone to the Cleveland police with a credible assault complaint against Anthony Sawell at that specific address. The third time, Gladys Wade in 2008, another woman before that, and now Latunda Billups in September 2009. 3 women, same house, same man. The investigation that followed Billups's complaint moved by most accounts slowly. Warrants took time. Sawell wasn't immediately located. And then, on October 29, 2009, a full month after Latunda Billups walked into a police station and told them she'd been raped at 11205, Imperial Avenue officers finally executed a search warrant at the property. They were looking for Anthony Sawell in connection with a rape. What they found was something else entirely. The first 2 bodies were on the 3rd floor. Diane Turner and Talasha Fortson, both in advanced stages of decomposition, in a bedroom with the windows open, those windows that the neighbors had noticed all summer, the ones that never seemed to close no matter the weather. Investigators called for backup immediately, called the coroner's office, started pulling warrants for a full excavation of the property. What followed over the next several days was one of the most disturbing crime scene investigations in Cleveland's history. Bodies in crawl spaces on the 3rd floor. A skull later identified as belonging to LaShonda Long, 24 years old, the youngest of the 11, wrapped inside a bucket in the basement. The rest of LaShonda Long has never been found. 2 women buried in shallow graves in the basement. 3 more in the backyard, found when investigators brought in a backhoe and started turning over the earth. 11 women, in and around a 3-story house on a residential street in Cleveland. Some had been there for over 2 years. The oldest case, Crystal Dozier, had been missing since May 2007, 29 months before anyone came to look. Anthony Sawell was not at the house when police arrived. He was found the following day, arrested without much incident. A 50-year-old man who had been living on Imperial, Avenue for 4 years and had been registered on the sex offender list the entire time and had checked in regularly and had answered the door when officers came for compliance visits. The city of Cleveland, when the full scope of what had happened became clear, was confronted with questions it couldn't easily answer. Why hadn't the complaints been followed up on more urgently? Why had 3 separate assault reports against the same man at the same address not generated a faster response? Why had the missing persons reports filed by the families of these women not connected to anything, not triggered any investigation, not caused anyone to look more carefully at the neighborhood or the man who lived there? The city's answer eventually was $1.3 million in settlement payments to the victims' families, an acknowledgement in the only formal language institutions tend to use that something had gone wrong, that the response had been inadequate, that women had died who might not have died if the system had taken their families seriously when they came asking for help. Tonia Carmichael was 53 years old. She'd earned her barber license and her real estate license. She'd worked as a medical secretary and a bartender. She had 2 daughters and a son, and she'd struggled with addiction for years, and the addiction had cost her things she could never get back. But she was still someone's mother, still someone's friend, still a person with a history and a name and a life that had been more than the circumstances that made her vulnerable. Her mother had reported her missing in December 2008, had called and filed the paperwork and waited. Tonia Carmichael's body was found in Anthony Sawell's backyard in October 2009, 11 months between the report and the discovery. I don't know how her mother absorbed that information. I don't know what it feels like to have filed the report, done the right thing, and then found out 11 months later that your daughter was in a backyard 3 miles away the whole time, that she was there while you were waiting, that every day you spent expecting a call from the police, every day you spent hoping she'd just walked back in, she was already gone, and nobody was coming to tell you. Nancy Cobbs was 44 years old. She vanished in April 2009. Her family did what families do, filed a missing persons report, searched abandoned buildings, printed flyers, and posted them around the neighborhood, called everyone they could think of. 6 months of searching. 6 months of her family walking the streets of Cleveland looking for a woman who was already inside a house on Imperial Avenue. Her body was found in October 2009. Janice Webb's friend, Ida Garrett, had been asking about her since April. Crystal Dozier's son, who was a U.S. Marine, who came home on leave specifically to look for his mother, had spent months trying to get someone to take the case seriously. Michelle Mason's family had filed their report and grown frustrated and kept pushing anyway, because what else do you do? What other option is there when the police won't move and your family member is gone and the only tool you have is persistence? I keep coming back to these families, to the image of Crystal Dozier's son, a United States Marine, coming home on leave and spending that time walking the same streets the police weren't walking, looking for his mother in a city that had decided she wasn't worth looking for. That image sits with me in a way I can't quite shake. Here is someone who serves his country, who comes home to Cleveland, and the one thing he wants to do with that time, find his mother, is a thing the city has decided is not its problem. She was in Anthony Sawell's house the whole time, has been since May 2007. The reporter Rachel Dissel, who covered this case for the Plain Dealer, said it plainly. Many of the families went to the police, and the police wouldn't even take a report. Police would tell them that if they're using drugs, they'll come back when they're ready. That's the sentence that explains everything. That one sentence. If they're using drugs, they'll come back when they're ready. That's the policy that allowed Anthony Sawell 2 years and 11 victims. Not his cunning, not any particular cleverness on his part, just that sentence, repeated at precinct desks across Cleveland to families who came in asking for help and left with nothing. Because what comes next is the part where the city of Cleveland has to look at itself in a very specific mirror, and what it sees there isn't easy. Not for the police, not for the city government, not for anyone who was in a position to notice and didn't, or noticed and didn't push hard enough, or pushed and got told it wasn't their problem. The trial opened in June 2011 at Cuyahoga County Courthouse in Cleveland, maybe one of the most emotionally charged trials that city had seen in years, probably one of the most anticipated given everything that had come out in the 2 years since the bodies were found. Anthony Sawell sat at the defense table looking, by most accounts, completely unremarkable. Basically the same quiet 50-something man the neighbors on Imperial Avenue had always described as just a guy. Nothing special, maybe a little odd, but nothing alarming. His attorneys entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that his childhood, the abuse and the chaos and the things that had been done to him before he was old enough to understand them, had damaged him in ways so profound that he couldn't be held responsible for what he'd become. They brought in experts to talk about his brain, about trauma and its effects, about the relationship between what happens to a child and what that child eventually does to other people. It was maybe a credible argument in theory, probably something that deserves to be taken seriously in a lot of cases. But here's the thing about Anthony Sawell specifically. The prosecution's response to that argument was 5 women. 5 women who had been inside that house and gotten out alive. LaTundra Billups sat in that courtroom and told the jury what Anthony Sawell had done to her in September 2009. Gladys Wade testified. Sean Morris testified. 3 women who had gone to that house and survived and reported it, and in some cases been turned away by police, and in some cases waited years for this moment, basically sitting 10 feet from the man who'd hurt them and saying out loud what had happened. Think about what that takes. Really think about it. They'd already been disbelieved once, maybe more than once. They'd already sat across from police officers who'd implied or said outright that women like them weren't reliable witnesses, weren't worth following up on, would probably come back when they were ready. And here they were in a courtroom doing it again, asking to be believed one more time, this time in front of a jury. The jury believed them. On July 22, 2011, Anthony Sawell was convicted on 81 counts. Not one count, 81. Basically every charge the grand jury had returned. 11 counts of aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, attempted murder. The full accounting of 2 years on Imperial Avenue, compressed into verdicts read aloud one by one, while the families of 11 women sat in that courtroom. Crystal Dozier's family had been waiting since May 2007. Tonia, Carmichael's mother, had filed a missing persons report in December 2008, basically a year before anyone went to look. They were all there when the jury said guilty, 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 11 times for 11 women. On August 12th, he was sentenced to death. And then the other reckoning started. The one that wasn't about Anthony Sawell specifically, the one about the city of Cleveland, and what it had and hadn't done when the families of these women came asking for help. Multiple lawsuits were filed, maybe by attorneys representing the victims' families, probably starting within months of the discovery in 2009. The central argument was straightforward. The Cleveland Police Department had been given multiple chances to stop Anthony Sawell, and had failed to follow up. Gladys Wade had reported an assault at 11,205 Imperial Avenue in 2008. LaTundra Billups had reported a rape at the same address in September 2009, a full month before police executed the search warrant. And behind both of those, years of missing persons reports from families who'd been told to wait and see, who'd been told their daughters and sisters would come back when they were ready, who'd been told basically that the disappearance of a black woman with an addiction history wasn't something worth urgency. The city of Cleveland settled. More than $1.3 million paid out to the victims' families. I mean, not to the women who died because they were gone, but to the families trying to understand why nobody had come looking sooner. The settlement didn't require anyone to admit wrongdoing. Maybe that's just how settlements work. Probably the city's lawyers made sure of that. But $1.3 million is the number the city of Cleveland put on what it owed to 11 families who'd been failed by the people who were supposed to protect them, and that number is somewhere between an acknowledgement and an apology. Basically, the closest institutions usually come to either. Rachel Dissel, an investigative reporter at the Plain Dealer who'd covered the case from the beginning, kept asking the harder questions long after the trial was over. Had the policies changed? Were missing persons reports from black women in vulnerable situations being handled differently now? What had the internal review found, and what had actually been done about it? I don't know that those questions ever got fully satisfying answers. I mean, I genuinely don't know, probably because nobody was particularly eager to document their failures in a way that could be referenced later. The $1.3 million got paid. The policies got reviewed, maybe in the way policies always get reviewed after something catastrophic, basically with a lot of internal paperwork and some procedural language and a general institutional desire to move on and stop being the story. What I do know is that the women who were already dead couldn't benefit from any of it. Crystal Dozier had been missing since May 2007, 2.5 years before anyone came to look. Whatever changes followed, whatever reviews were conducted, whatever trainings were implemented or policies were rewritten, none of it brought her back. None of it gave her 7 children their mother. And that's the weight that sits under every part of this story. Probably the thing you can't policy your way out of. The gap between when these women disappeared and when anyone came looking is where 11 lives ended. Anthony Sawell appealed his conviction, filed papers arguing the trial had been unfair, that evidence had been handled improperly, that he hadn't received adequate representation. The Ohio Supreme Court reviewed everything in a 5-2 decision and upheld the convictions and the sentence, basically found no reversible error. He appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear it, maybe with a one-line order, probably without much deliberation, given the strength of the evidence below. He spent the years between his conviction and his death on death row at the Ohio State Penitentiary. I don't know what those years looked like for him exactly. Probably much the same as death row anywhere. A cell, limited movement, legal filings that kept getting denied, waiting. Ohio has a death penalty but uses it slowly, and Sowell's execution had been pushed back multiple times through the appellate process. Basically, a pattern that's common in states that maintain capital punishment but aren't in a hurry to use it. In January 2021, he was transferred, not to an execution facility but to the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus to the end-of-life care unit. He had a terminal illness. The prison system didn't disclose what it was. They just said it wasn't COVID-19 and left it at that. He'd been on death row for a decade by then, probably aging in the way people age in prison, maybe not well. The execution that the jury had recommended in 2011 was still technically pending when his body started failing on its own. On February 8, 2021, Anthony Sowell died. He was 61 years old. He was never executed. The illness got there first, probably a few years before any scheduled execution date. Basically, the state had sentenced him to death and then watched him die a different way without ever carrying out the sentence. He died in a hospital unit in Columbus on a Monday afternoon at 3:27 p.m., and that was that. The Corrections Department spokeswoman gave a brief statement. The news ran it as a short item, and on Imperial Avenue, the Garden of 11 Angels was still there, and the 11 women whose names are written into it were still gone. The house at 11205 Imperial Avenue was demolished in December 2011. The city brought in a crew and took it down, hauled everything away. The neighbors watched, maybe people who'd been trying to get someone to pay attention to that house for years, probably people who'd smelled what they'd smelled and wondered and been told it was the sausage shop. The lot sat empty for a while, just a gap where a 3-story house used to be, where a woman had closed her kitchen window every morning all summer because something in the air made her body recoil before her brain could name why. In November 2021, 12 years after the first bodies were found, the city unveiled a memorial on that lot. They called it the Garden of 11 Angels, designed with input from the victims' families, plantings, and markers, a place where 11 names are written into the ground where 11 women died. Frances Webb Speed, the sister of Janice Webb, said it would give the families some added closure, that a lot of them still lived in the neighborhood, and it would be good for that space to be something other than an eyesore, to be something worth looking at instead of something you drove past without meeting its eyes. And I think she's right. I think she's describing something true about how communities have to live with the places where terrible things happened. You can't just leave a gap. Eventually something has to go there. Whether it's closure, I honestly don't know. Maybe that's not the right word for what the families of these 11 women get to have, given everything. Given the missing persons reports that went nowhere, and the years of not knowing, and the trial, and the settlement, and watching the man who killed their daughters and sisters die in a hospital bed before Ohio got around to executing him. Closure implies a door shutting. These doors didn't shut cleanly. Crystal Dozier, Kishana Culver, LaShonda Long, Michelle Mason, Tonia Carmichael, Nancy Cobbs, Imelda Hunter, Talasha Fortson, Kim Smith, Janice Webb, Diane Turner. 11 women, 11 names in a garden on Imperial Avenue. It's not enough, but it's something. And maybe that's all there is, probably. When the case is over and the man is gone and the house is a garden and the neighborhood is still there, still the same neighborhood, still the same streets where these women lived their lives and were failed by the systems that were supposed to notice when they disappeared. The Garden of 11 Angels is still there, open to anyone who wants to go. It's on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, and if you ever find yourself in that part of the city, maybe go. Stand there for a minute. Say their names if you want to. They deserve at least that much. And maybe that's what this case ultimately is. Underneath all of it, not just a story about Anthony Sawwell, but a story about which lives a city decides are worth protecting, and which ones it decides can wait. He chose his victims deliberately, maybe not in a calculated, strategic way, but in the way predators always choose, from the margins, from the places where the safety net has the most holes. He was right that those women would be harder to notice missing. He was right that their families would have a harder time being heard. He lived inside that truth for 2 years on Imperial Avenue, and it protected him longer than anything else. That's the thing about this case that stays with you, probably the hardest thing to sit with long after the verdict and the settlement and the garden. The system didn't fail by accident. It failed in patterns. And those patterns were already there, waiting, long before Anthony Sawwell moved in. So that's the story. Anthony Sawwell, Imperial Avenue. 11 women, maybe over 2 years, probably longer than it should have taken for anyone to notice. A smell that the neighborhood complained about for months and was told was coming from a sausage shop. Families who went to the police and were basically told to wait, that their daughters would come back when they were ready, that women who use drugs tend to drift and come back, and it's probably nothing. And a registered sex offender who understood, maybe not consciously, but in some practical way, that certain people are watched for, and certain people aren't, and who lived inside that knowledge on a residential street in Cleveland for 2 years. The Garden of 11 Angels is there now. On the lot where the house was, Crystal, Tishana, LaShonda, Michelle, Tanya, Nancy, Imelda, Talasha, Kim, Janice, Diane. 11 names in the ground, probably the most honest thing the city of Cleveland has done in connection with this case. Basically an acknowledgement that something happened here that deserves to be remembered. Anyway, it's raining now. Maybe steady, maybe picking up a little, the kind of rain that settles in for the night and doesn't apologize for it. You can probably hear it wherever you are, that sound against the windows or on the roof, the way it fills up the quiet and makes everything outside feel very far away. If you made it all the way here tonight, if you're still awake and still listening, drop A in the comments. I want to know who stayed with me through this one. And if this is where you come when the night gets long, hit subscribe. There are more stories. There always are. The rain keeps falling. Rest now